Putin may have miscalculated on many dimensions, such as the strength of the Russian army, the strength of the Ukrainian forces, the reaction of the Europeans, because he was counting probably on a much weaker one. But what he was counting on, and I think I addressed this also in your
earlier discussion,
yes, was practically to gain this pole position in the systemic rivalry between United States and China for the future. So that none of these two systemic rivals can afford themselves to ignore the Russian position. And this is where he placed Russia in 2025. Now, will this end the war? By no means, absolutely no. We will have a break, and after probably 2-3 years, my expectation is that this war goes beyond 2028, 2030, depending on the agility of the Russian forces, because they are right now in a new modernization cycle. Every single war that they waged in the last 20 years, they learned and adapted.
You're on StratNews Global. I'm Nitin Gokhale. And my guest today is Velina Tchakarova, familiar face on StratNews Global for years together now, ever since we started, a friend in Europe, and someone who's on a visit to India, which she religiously undertakes every year for the Raisina dialogue, and then comes additionally for a couple of trips. But good to see you again, Velina, and welcome.
It's great to see you again. It's such a good feeling actually being back to Delhi and to India.
True. But we are going to talk about Europe more than Delhi and India. And of course, India will come into the conversation. So, you know, one of the curiosity that everyone has in India in the strategic space is how's Europe going to cope with what Trump has unleashed in terms of taking decisions left, right and center. J.D. Vance, the Vice President, really ramrodding the Europeans at the Munich Security Conference. Where does Europe stand today as far as the global scenario is concerned?
Yeah, that's probably the $1 million question right now, because you remember very well what kind of reaction we witnessed immediately after J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, and then what followed up was practically the initiated process of talks with the Russians and separately with the Ukrainians on behalf of the US, where the Europeans were completely sidelined. And the sad reality is that it took Europe one kind of move by Trump that they interpreted as, a kind of backstabbing, to finally decide to act, to get their act together in the security and defense field, but not 3+ years of ongoing war.
The war really didn't have that reality check.
There was no sense of urgency before that. I mean, of course, there were concrete measures, such as the sanctions and the military aid for Ukraine, and also obviously the international diplomacy, but there was no sense of urgency. And suddenly this public outcry, this kind of awkward emotional state of our political decision makers and our European bureaucrats of kind of hopelessness following these kind of events. And this is what I seriously cannot buy.
They should have seen it coming.
They should have seen it coming. They should have prepared accordingly. They didn't do their homework, and now they are just interpreting it as, as something that Trump initiated, right? So that's the first. Yes. Second, if we are to understand and analyze what an adequate European response to this Trump administration should be, then we need first and foremost to consider that there are 3 different dimensions to it. There is the ideological one.
Right.
Here we have a situation where Trump administration is looking at the European decision makers. Yes, I'm generalizing, of course, so there are exceptions, but let's take the average example. So they are looking at these European decision makers and these European bureaucrats in a similar way. They are looking at, let's say, the governors in New York or California. That's right. The ideological, the complete ideological gap, first and foremost. Absolutely. So there is no space for trust, right? Second, there is the economic dimension. Here, what Trump administration is intending to do and is going to do, and it was anticipated long ago, is not just tariff policy and not just trade war. Is this complete decoupling from China first and foremost. China is the big target where we might end up with probably something like 60% tariff, at the end of the journey, and nobody will remain unaffected. So, of course, the European Union, given the fact that Trump is an anti-globalist and he cannot accept organizations such as the European Union, is going to be a collateral of that. So why hasn't been the case that the president of the European Commission hadn't prepared accordingly to, initiate a team and to actually, travel to Washington to try to convey the message and to try to mitigate. Nothing of that happened. We just received the message. And then finally, but most importantly, there is the geopolitical dimension of this relationship. It's about security and defense. It's about the trust, the values-based approach. Remember, rules-based warfare, what happened with that? And here we see also a big cleavage because the Americans are now openly saying what everybody was expecting, and we were talking about it year after year, namely the US withdrawal from the old continent, and telling the Europeans, dear friends, now it's your turn to take care
of yourself,
yes, when it comes to security and defense, with the big difference that we are now in the 4th year of the largest conventional war.
That's right.
Since the end of
Second World War. Absolutely.
That's it.
That's the extremely important points. And let me start with the last point that you made about Europe undertaking its own security and own defense. Now, for years or decades, it was outsourced to the United States, and the United States was happy to go along. Now that this has happened, what are the steps that the European nations, the big ones, Germany, France, and others, going to take, if you anticipate, if at all you have assessed, will have to take to go back to creating their own defense system, their own defense ecosystem, as well as build their armed forces?
Well, first and foremost, let's start with a reality check, and then I will make some proposals.
Sure.
You come from the defense sector. You are very well aware of how things are happening in the defense sector. You cannot, from an announcement to a real project, and that means, of course, production chain, and putting a product on the market. This is a process that sometimes, depending on the technology, takes 10, 15 years.
Absolutely.
So this is a reality check. This is something that I have known. And even, once again, let me just use the reference with the beginning of the war, which is 2022, when, remember, just the first week after the war was officially launched, when the German government, under the then, Chancellor, made the announcement of Zeitenwende. So transition, full transition.
Full transition, yeah.
And full transition meaning also a shift in the mindset that we need to start spending more. And the promise was about 100 billion euro for defense spending in Germany alone, right? So now, if you ask what happened with this 100 billion, nobody can give you a clear answer. So that's the first.
True.
Between announcement, concrete steps and measures, and a final product, I just don't see how you will reduce, let's say, in the ideal time span, maybe you will reduce 15 years to maybe
10 years?
10 years,
yes.
If you are lucky enough to find the right partners, because that's the next thing. Nothing of all these ambitious programs can be achieved on its own. That means that you will need partners within Europe, but also outside of Europe, as it happened, for instance, with South Korea, when the Polish government was not able to find procurement, in the West.
Yes.
What did they do? They reached out to other like-minded partners to just fill the gaps, which actually meant also increasing the defense budget. So when it comes to readiness, now there is a shift in the mindset. I agree.
Okay.
So finally, we are openly talking in the public. This was not easy. That we need to spend more.
Right.
That's at
on
least
defense.
On defense. That's at least something. That's a real set shift. But then again, something's got to give in this equation.
Correct.
Because if you remember previously, before this ambitious announcement on 800 billion euro for the next years, we still don't know exactly how this money is going to be spent, on what exactly the money is going to be spent. There will be 150 billion loan program,
sure.
and then you will have additional programs for kind of I suppose collaboration between member states, the rearm program. But my point is the following: this is not a money that the institutions in like the European Commission, but also the governments,
each of the government will
member
have to
states
spend.
have.
Yes.
This is not the money that's at disposal. That means that the money has to be rerouted from somewhere else. So this will be programs. There are already discussions in Brussels, like cohesion programs, other funds. I suppose that's my expectation, that there will be some money being rerouted from the climate-related programs, the decarbonization. But in the end, it's going to be either creating more debt on behalf of the member states,
Right.
because they don't have the money,
Correct.
or there will be cuts being
Elsewhere.
done, mostly in the social welfare. So good luck to the governments
Yes.
trying to explain this to their aging population, which means that the bigger share of the voters is a population of 50 plus.
Correct.
Which has very different expectations
Sure.
than, let's say, investing in defense. Okay, so that's the big problem I see. Final point, when I said something's got to give, let's not forget that before defense, the big discussion was actually on reindustrialization.
Right.
So there were plenty of reports coming from very famous former bureaucrats and former, decision makers in member states, such as Mario Draghi, but also Letters report. And these reports were dedicated to industry, to the revival
Right.
of the industry and to the competitiveness. So now my question is, we started from decarbonization, where we
Right.
wanted to spend trillions.
On
And in
decarbonization,
order to become the first climate neutral continent in the world.
Right.
Then we moved to industrialization, and then suddenly, because the Americans are now behaving not the way we were expecting, we are going to spend on defense. My question is, what is not going to what are we going to erase from this equation?
That's
Because
right.
you cannot have the cake and
All
eat it.
you can't have the full spectrum
Yes.
with you. Absolutely valid point here again. The other point here about defense is to get the right human resource. And because Europe hasn't had, many European countries don't have strong armies or defense forces, and the younger generation may not be even aware that they are required to do all this. How are they going to overcome that problem?
I don't know. Because the reality is such that we have, in general, such a big demographic challenge. In fact, most of the member states are affected by that, to the extent that some member states started, thinking of special programs, how to kind of introduce incentives to the society to create kind of positive scenario. But if you take a look at statistics, and statistics are quite brutal on the demographic outlook for the next 10 to 20 years, the picture is dire. It's dire in general.
Yes.
So not just aging population, but as you rightfully pointed out, you have much reduced pot for recruitment.
That's right.
So you have less and less and less. We are looking at the statistics. We are already seeing that the problem is already here.
Yes.
But it's just that the political decision makers are trying to
Just kicking the can down the road.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
That's,
So here, what is going to happen is that probably there will be a partial solution with the help of technology, because the modern warfare includes, meanwhile, also cyber domain.
Yes.
That does not necessarily demand. You have men on the loop, but
Right.
still you have more opportunities with the help of technology.
True.
This will be the one dimension, and the other dimension will be some sort of, I imagine, kind of civil, military, public-private partnerships, because there is no longer possible for the conventional way of how armies were, were functioning in the 20th century to make it in the 21st century.
That's
Certainly not. So we are getting these articles now.
Right.
That Generation Z would like to rather be occupied, but not go to war, not have to fight.
Yes.
There are all these polls being conducted in the member states, polls such as showing percentage of young people who would like to defend their country in the case of attack. So it's really devastating, devastating picture right now. So for the moment, I think that it's not going to be about the quantity of money. Is what will be the decisive factor that will really punch us hard in the face and will bring us down to reality. But it's going to be more about the scarcity of human capital.
That's right.
That will disable a lot of these plans for the modernization of armies.
Right. Which will disempower Europe nothing else would. But I need to take a break. Don't go away. I will come back and continue the conversation with my friend Velina Tchakarova, who is visiting India from Vienna, Austria. And of course then look at the other dimensions about Russia getting into Europe and Russia getting away with what it is going to get away. In fact, as we speak, I think President Putin and President Trump are going to have a phone call. So we don't know what's going to be the outcome of that, but we will discuss that and something more. Don't go away.
Should I? Yeah. मन में वो पायरेट्स ऑफ द कैरिबियन का म्यूजिक आ रहा है।
Pay attention. Today we have received intel regarding poaching activities in our area. We are going to intercept the boat and apprehend the culprits. Am I clear?
Yes, sir.
How's the Josh?
Yes, sir.
Let's go. Take post. उठाओ 1 2
Rolling.
Welcome back. I am in conversation with Velina Tchakarova on Europe and its current state of affairs after President Trump's several moves towards the continent, and of course what is going to happen as far as the Ukraine-Russia war is concerned, and what India has been advocating. Has it been now vindicated? So let me start with what's happening on the war front. I mean, we spoke about what may happen in the future and on defense, but President Trump is clearly wanting to end the Russia-Ukraine war, and which may not be on the terms that the Europeans wanted, perhaps. So how is it going to pan out in your assessment?
Well, first, we need to understand what the American perspective is on the Trump administration, and that is that he wants these two ceasefires in Gaza and Ukraine, and he will pressure, all sides to get what he wants by all means. And we are already seeing actually that he has achieved more than 4 years of Biden administration when it comes to bringing the two sides to talk indirectly to each other.
Yes.
And what I expect, of course, because that's what he wants. So he wants to sell it as a peace plan.
Sure.
But in reality, what he will get is a ceasefire. That's just the only deliverable he can get in the short term. Still, of course, major game changer for everybody involved, because in reality, the way how the war was, being stalled. And in fact, it was developing, in 2024, given first and foremost the commitments of the West to support Ukraine. I mean, what they were promising and what they were delivering,
Yes.
and given also the difficulties, of course, on the ground. We are talking about 2,000 plus long kilometers of border. It's just mind-blowing on every possible scale for the military experts to cover what's really happening there.
Absolutely.
And given also the adaptation on both sides, Russian side and Ukrainian side, to continue fighting.
Sure.
So the readiness, the willingness, the will to fight
Right.
is still there on both sides. So we need to understand that. So here, without, let's say, the interference of Trump, we will have been still in the very same scenario of
2022
of a
or
war of
2023.
attrition.
Yeah, war of attrition
Until
and
the
prolonged war.
Very prolonged war until the one side obviously
Gets tired.
Gets tired, or there is a political shift, for instance, or people get tired and start demanding for, for a change. So here, this is what I expect for 2025. Ceasefire probably in the next 3 to 6 months. What we need to understand from American perspective is that that Ukraine is not a priority for this administration. So I mean foreign policy priority, I mean security.
Anything, yeah.
Anything. But Russia is. Because first and foremost, this administration does not look at Russia as a strategic challenge. It
Not an
looks at
existential
Russia
threat.
as rather as an opportunity by relaunching a strategic dialogue to weaken this modus operandi of the Dragonbear, to lure Russia away from China, because the only strategic goal and the only strategic target of this administration in geopolitical terms is China.
Right.
It's all about China, 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 ideologically, technologically, economically, but also in terms of security and defense, militarily.
Absolutely.
So here, this is the idea. This is what Trump is going to do. The expectation is that there will be something offered, to the Russians. Probably recognition of Crimea. Finally, an international recognition.
After 10 years.
Yes,
Or
of
11
Crimea.
years. 11 years, yeah.
Then what Russia will be demanding, in my view, is certainly also full control of Donbass, because they're almost controlling full of Donbass. And now the question mark I have is about Zaporizhia and Kherson,
Right.
because they haven't been, controlling the whole of the regions.
That's
There
right.
are a lot of question marks there.
Correct.
You have the biggest nuclear power plant in whole of Europe, in Zaporizhia. So there are question marks there. NATO membership is going to be erased from the constitution of Ukraine. This will be an absolute red line for Russia. And then, of course, question mark is about the scalability of the Ukrainian armed forces, because right now Ukraine has the strongest European army.
Right.
Next to Russia.
Just imagine.
So think about it from the perspective of potential membership of Ukraine in the European Union. So all European states are currently relying on Ukraine to be this last resort of defense.
Against Russia.
Against Russia.
Yeah.
Because they know for a fact that if Ukraine falls, and I'm not saying that there will be an incentive for direct military attack on NATO country, but there will be an incentive to create a scenario in which the NATO membership, for instance, of countries like the Baltics, will be questioned, because you can actually create other kind of attack. It doesn't have to be a conventional attack the way we understand it.
True.
It can be a sabotage action, sabotage.
It can be a
operation.
cyber attack. It can
But
be
the
anything.
moment when Ukraine falls, there will be a new geopolitical situation, because the consequence of it will be. So from Russian point of view, this is a good scenario, because it will turn out that Putin may have miscalculated on many dimensions, such as the strength of the Russian army, the strength of the Ukrainian forces, the reaction of the Europeans, because he was counting probably on a much weaker one. But what he was counting on, and I think I addressed this also in your
earlier discussion,
show, yes, was practically to gain this pole position in the systemic rivalry between United States and China for the future.
Absolutely.
So that none of these two systemic rivals can afford themselves to ignore the Russian position. And this is where he placed Russia in 2025. Now, will this end the war? By no means, absolutely no. We will have a break, and after probably 2-3 years, my expectation is that this war goes beyond 2028, 2030, depending on the agility of the Russian forces, because they are right now in a new modernization cycle. Every single war that they waged in the last 20 years, they learned and adapted.
That's
so
right.
now they have to draw the lessons from this war, to adapt accordingly, to modernize, and then to strike back.
Very interesting thought on that, because nobody has sort of said this on our channel, at least, that there could be a revival of the war 2-3 years later. But I'll hold you. Let's hold that thought for a while. Let's look at the role that India is hoping to play going forward. Prime Minister Modi, in one of the interviews just earlier this week, mentioned that he counseled President Zelensky that no matter how much support you get from NATO, how much assurances you get, ultimately you'll have to sit across the table to resolve this issue with Russia. Looking back, India's stand on not taking sides in the war between Russia and Ukraine seems to have been vindicated. How should India, and what role, if at all, can India play as far as this war is concerned, and in Europe? Because some people have suggested India can send peacekeeping forces under the UN or even otherwise, and also help Ukraine reconstruction post the war. You see any of these scenarios coming through?
I see both scenarios. The one including Indian troops, given the fact that India has major experience as a peacekeeping force within the framework of the United Nations. In fact, if I don't know whether I'm wrong, but it's probably one of the three most important
largest
contributors of peacekeeping forces. So there is a DNA in that. There is an experience, an international experience, which will add to the credibility of India. And the second scenario being involved in the reconstruction of Ukraine, given the fact that the estimations show of currently something of around 600 billion euro at least, which means that you have to multiply by factor at least of 1.5 to 2 to understand the real, the real dimension of destruction, there are indeed a lot of avenues for future collaboration. Now, here the question about what the geopolitical positioning of India should be is more interesting in my view, because first and foremost, I would argue that the government and the political leadership had a very clear idea how India should position itself.
Sure.
And right from the beginning, if you remember, there was so much pressure coming from the West, I mean, from European countries, where I was trying to convey the message and to help them understand that there was an anticipated position. And I was expecting a concrete position on behalf of India, being one that India would go first and foremost after its own interest. So in the field, again, you have to differentiate. In the field of economics, India would, of course, follow its own needs.
Naturally.
Would India capitalize on the oil?
Yes, the
purchase?
The inexpensive Russian oil.
Absolutely. If you have to take care of 1.5 billion people, you will go for the for the best offer on the market.
Sure.
If you have to feed 1.5 billion people, you will go and deepen the strategic partnership with Russia to secure the fertilizers that you need as the biggest wheat producer in the world, which is India.
India, exactly.
Okay, so these are things that were clear to my mind that will be are here to stay.
Determine India's position.
And I will determine the Indian position. Again, at the very same time, probably the Indian Prime Minister was among the first to openly tell Russian President Putin in the face that this is not the time. That this is not the time for war.
This is not the era of war. Yeah, exactly.
I don't think how many other leaders dared to tell him this in the face, openly telling him that we know for a fact who started this war.
Correct.
We might play with the language and the rhetoric, which is understandable for each state diplomacy, but in the end we know what's happening here. So here, this is for me, I think this position hasn't changed much right from the beginning.
Not at all.
So he reached out to, he not just preserved but deepened the strategic partnership with Russia for very clear geopolitical
and in national interest.
First and foremost, the national interest, as I explained, but also the regional context.
Yes.
If you are facing not one but two direct regional threats, and the one is engaging in an obvious, comprehensive relationship of strategic coordination with Russia, you will make sure to do the balance.
Engage with Russia and balance it out.
And what happened eventually was also the normalization of the relationship between India and China, which was a normal, to me personally, after 3 years of this war, was the normal continuum of this kind of responsible leadership, not just to be ideological, but to find the avenues for
being a realist, I think.
To be brutally pragmatic. It's not just realism, because you can be realist but still stick to your ideology.
Right.
And
but
say,
he was pragmatic.
It would be good to do it, but because my ideology doesn't allow me, doesn't permit me, so in my view, this was a very logical path of engagement to make sure that right now what really counts from Indian perspective is development. I want to uplift my own people. I have the best opportunities right now for my own population to finally get uplifted. It's happening there,
right in front of our eyes.
I need the investments. I need the predictability of a regional framework and more stability on the global arena, which I don't have. So with all the inflationary impact coming from this war and the other wars, so what I can do is at least to make sure that there is some sort of predictability in the relationship with the biggest security challenge I have in the region, which happens to be also the closest ally of one of my strategic partners. So this is brutal pragmatism, what most of the countries in the world have forgotten to pursue. So they have turned too ideological.
Too much dependence on ideological.
So will we see, if you ask me, will we see actually India hosting Ukraine and Russia in a kind of mediation effort? I would say rather unlikely.
Unlikely.
Because look at the scale. Like I wouldn't like to put India in the same, even though that we can argue that these are like middle powers which are
I
very
don't think
important.
India will
but I
be-
wouldn't like to put India now with this on the same spot with countries like Saudi Arabia or Turkey,
Sure.
which have proven already to play this
Mediation
kind of mediation role.
India hasn't traditionally done that, so it's difficult to change that position. So you're right, absolutely bang on. I would say assessment and analysis of what India has done and what's happening in Europe. As usual, very insightful. So thank you very much for taking time from your busy schedule in Delhi and coming and talking to us. Don't go away. Keep watching StratNews Global. You know where to reach us. Your comments are always welcome. And of course, our social media handles are well known to you. So do send feedback, and of course, keep watching StratNews Global. We will continue to bring you such insightful conversations. For the time being, it's goodbye.